Today, I am going to be continuing talking about the book, The Practice of Lojong by Traleg Rinpoche. And I am going to be talking about point 5, which is measuring the success of mind training. It's important to have an idea of how a person is doing if they're practicing mind training, to know if you are making progress, know if you are doing it right, or if you need to change approach in some way or another. And so the question is, are you becoming more oriented towards other people, or are you just getting more mired and stuck in your own habitual selfish patterns? On the other hand, Prahlad Rinpoche mentions that we don't want to be obsessive about our progress and checking it all the time. That's just another fixation. So there are 4 slogans that are used to measure our progress, evaluate how we are doing. The first one, it's slogan number 19, all Dharma has a single purpose. And Dharma in this case means the teachings of the Buddha and the Buddhist teachings in general. There are other meanings to the word Dharma, but here it is the Buddhist teachings. The interesting thing is that the Buddhist teachings are huge. There is an incredible amount of teachings and then commentaries on the teachings of the Buddha. And it can get very confusing. Prahlad Rinpoche compared the Buddhist teachings to the Old and New Testament for Christians, and the Old and New Testament for Christians is a very, very small amount of writing compared to the Buddhist, let's say the canon. There are 108 volumes of sutras, which are the direct words of the Buddha, and then there are the commentaries on the sutras. Then there is the Tantra, and on and on and on. And the Buddha would, very simply, he would teach the audience. What might be appropriate for one audience would be very different for another audience. And you have to understand this. Sometimes the teachings can even seem contradictory because they are so different. But all of the Dharma, all of the teachings and the practices agree on a single purpose, and that is to liberate ourselves from samsara, to travel from a confused state of mind to an enlightened state of mind. Prahlad Rinpoche points out that the Dharma means knowable phenomena or knowable things. So this means things that we can actually know using our power of reasoning and our 5 senses. So our preoccupation with our ego is the main concern or the main cause of our mental delusions. And these delusions, if we follow them and believe them to be real, they become a downward spiral and we get more and more entangled in samsara. So we have to overcome this ego clinging and this egocentric way of looking at the world. And very simply, that means this conviction that there is a self-sufficient, a discrete self, a self that is unchanging. Sometimes it's described as a soul. In Hinduism, it is a higher self, and there are other words for it too. I remember attending a teaching one time. This was in Minneapolis at the old Morningside Twin Cities KTC. And Bardik Tukul Rinpoche was teaching. He had a translator. I believe it was Yeshe Gyamtso that was translating for him. And the question came up, do we have a soul? So the translator translated that into Tibetan. And then Bardik Rinpoche responded in Tibetan to the translator, and then the translator responded in Tibetan, and then Barter Rinpoche responded, and there was quite a lot of time spent discussing this simple question. And finally, the translator turned to the person that asked the question, and he said, no. 5 minutes of discussion was going over the fine points of what soul means, which can get very complicated. But the simple answer is no, we do not have a soul. We do not have a higher self. The Hindu word for higher self is Atman. And the Buddha said An Atman, which is a negation. An is a negation. So basically, no self. You've probably heard that once or twice before when Buddhism and self has come up. It's interesting, way back in 2000, 23 years ago, I went to Rochester to see a cardiologist because I was having heart trouble. The cardiologist was a Sikh. He had a big, one of these turbans on his head. They don't cut their hair, the men. And we had a little conversation about this. And I said, An Atman. And he understood immediately that this is the negation of self. There is no self. Again, what this means is that there is nothing that is unchanging, that who we think we are is a result of causes and conditions. It is not separate from causes and conditions. It comes into being because of causes and conditions, and when the causes and conditions are no longer there for it to be sustained, it changes. I like to use Western psychology a little bit. You maybe have heard me say this before, that we've got early childhood psychology, we've got childhood psychology. I'm not sure what they call teenage psychology, but we've got that too. And then you've got adult psychology, then you have midlife crisis psychology, then you have geriatric psychology, and you have hospice psychology. And there's a few other in between there that I haven't mentioned yet. But the point being, depending upon where we are in our life cycle, our minds operate very differently, and we have very different viewpoint of things. And it is because we're constantly changing, that there is nothing that is constant, no matter how much you fight it. I remember, of course, in the late 50s, flat top haircuts were very popular. And I remember seeing men wearing flat tops back in the early 70s, even the late 70s. But even they are no longer wearing flat tops if they are alive yet. We all change, no matter how much we, you might say, try to fight it. So we human beings, in fact, all sentient beings, get confused and have this mistaken logic that we think there is something that is permanent, inherent, unchanging about us. He uses possessing some kind of psychic substance, which he then defines as being a soul. Now, what we do have that's explained in Buddhism, what are called the 5 skandhas, and he uses a word that is very Western, psychophysical constituents. How about that for a definition of skandha and what this means? And it's actually quite accurate. The skandhas are collections, 5 different collections that have to do with our body and our mind and our experience. Form is the first skandha, and that refers to our body and our sense organs. Feeling, then cognition, formation, psychic propensities, and finally consciousness. So each of these It's a matter of causality rather than this is solid. And as I said, each one is really a collection. And this is intended to explain the development of self. I'm not going to go into this too deeply here, but it could easily be talked about for the whole rest of the hour. Very simply, what it means is that the Buddhist teachings and the teachings of the Buddha himself are what we call a self, or a soul is a collection of parts. And there is this logical progression that leads to thinking that there is something that is permanent, solid, individual, and so forth, but it's really just causes and conditions. The classic example that is used in the book and used many other places is a chariot, that you put the chariot together out of parts. But on the other end, you can take it apart and in this case, talk about scattering it on the ground, and you're not going to recognize it. You might not even be able to, if you collected all the parts, put it back together in the right order and come up with a chariot. You could come up with who knows what. But even the parts, the wooden parts, the spokes for the wheels, for instance, they're made out of wood, and wood is made out of cells and fibers, and those are made out of smaller parts, molecules, atoms, subatomic particles, and it gets to be that where is the chariot? It's just parts, pieces and parts. So this idea of a self is conditional. It has no inherent existence. And again, inherent meaning within itself. The existence is based on things beyond it, causes and condition beyond it. The self cannot cause itself to come into existence and does not have the ability to keep from becoming non-existent. This also includes external phenomena. This is a very, very, very important part to remember about the Dharma, because as I said, or as this slogan says, it can be very complicated, but it agrees on this one point. No matter how complicated the Dharma is, it is about weakening our attachment to ego and helping clear up confusion based on this attachment to this illusory, non-existent ego. So in the Mahayana, and the slogans, 7 points of mind training, are Mahayana teachings. This selflessness includes self, and it includes all external phenomena, no matter what it is, whether it be another person, a tree, a car, anything. None of this has a independent existence. It's all based on causes and conditions. There is this term co-emergent. The idea is that from emptiness, everything arises from emptiness. So things emerge from emptiness, independence on other things, other causes and conditions. So to help us appreciate this, it's good to use these slogans, memorize them, and think about them from time to time. To finish up this slogan, I'm going to read from this one quote that's in the book. Therefore, if your spiritual practice in general and your practice of mind training in particular fail to counter self-grasping, then the realization of mind training has not arisen in you. For whether your mind training has arisen in your heart is determined by whether it has become an antidote to self-grasping. So that is the commentary on slogan number 19. Number 20 is, of the two judges, rely on the principal one. Now, there are two judges here. One is yourself, the other is other people. And it is good to listen to other people, what they think of you, and so forth. But the bottom line is, if you are really practicing well and doing a lot of self-examination, you know yourself much better than other people know you. And if you know yourself well, then you know where there is work to do. Other people's opinion can help. It isn't disregard other people. It is that you really know yourself better than other people. And I think we all know that it is easy for people to think that we are, let's just say, better than we really are. Speaking for myself, I come in contact with many people in many different situations, and none of you see me 24/7. And you don't know what's going on the rest of the time. Not that I'm lurking in a dark alley at night waiting to attack anybody, but you have not seen all sides of me. And I have. So it's good to have the opinion of both others and yourself, but we really want to emphasize self-examination and observing ourselves. We also want to avoid being overly hard on ourselves. It can be easy to be very, very critical of ourselves. I have found that a lot of times, let's say there was this scale of 1 to 10, and 10 being that you are just, right up there with the Buddha, and 1, you are down there with Adolf Hitler, that you might think that you're a 2. We can really get down on ourselves and really depressed and so forth. And actually, that is very egocentric. It's fixating on your bad qualities, and it might seem bizarre, but it's like you think that you excel in being bad instead of arrogant in being good. You're arrogant about how bad you are. Needless to say, that's bizarre. Most of us, I would say, are probably 5 or a 6, maybe a 7. But it's up to you to decide. You see, this is my opinion, and you're not supposed to be listening to it as much as your own opinion. Be that as it may, there is a little quote here by Nagarjuna. I mispronounce these foreign words all the time. But know that men are like the mango fruit, unripe but appearing ripe, ripe but appearing unripe, unripe and appearing unripe, ripe and appearing ripe. In other words, to put it in plain English, you can't tell a book by looking at the cover. I think that can sum that up pretty easily. So only we can really judge ourselves. I found this next point to be rather interesting, that the Abhidharma recommends having shame when we are looking at ourselves and when we are by ourselves and doing self-examination, and follow decorum when we are in the presence of other people. Behave yourself, follow the social norms when you are with other people, and to avoid doing whatever you want, regardless of what people think at the time. Reminds me of back in the 60s, where you just do whatever you want to. And anyway, I'm kind of reminiscing now, but follow the norms, or at least try to, and behave the way other people expect you to behave. He points this out, and I kind of got a grin out of this. We can use manners strategically. And he said, for instance, if you are coming on to a potential partner, you can be just very nice and behave very nice, very good manners. Or you're in front of a jury and a judge, and then you can behave very nicely too. So avoid that kind of behavior. He talks about how to go into the self-assessment here. There's two parts. First of all, to try to get to know what you are really like. You're trying to assess how to overcome certain habits and work with our tendencies to harbor negative thoughts and attitudes. It's not about how to look good or to find how bad we really are. It's about what we are like deep inside, our thoughts, our attitudes, our habitual patterns, and do an honest assessment. Look at what our real motives and our opinions are. And he quotes Shanti Deva here. Examine yourself thus from every side, note harmful thoughts and every futile striving. Thus it is that heroes in the Bodhisattva path apply the remedies to keep a steady mind. And he said, avoid being, quote, the object of your own disapproval. It's one thing to see your shortcomings, but it's another thing to get stuck on them and keep, you might say, beating yourself up. See your shortcomings and then have the aspiration to improve and then do something about it. And he talks about self-deception, and he said, actually, it's relatively easy to overcome once that you recognize the illusions that self-deception depend on. And you realize that these illusions are unnecessary. Earlier in the 7 points of mind training, they talk about the power of exposure. And this is very helpful here. Exposing your faults and then applying the remedy. The other aspect of this self-assessment, this part 2, is how we can recognize our true character and qualities in spite of our delusions. So how do we know we're becoming better people? We're not just deceiving ourselves. So we need to, again, look deeply into ourselves. Are we really transformed? Is there a genuine shift from being obsessed about ourselves to being more concerned about others? And that would be a good sign if we are less self-obsessed and more concerned about others. There is a quote here, which I'm going to read. Others may recognize you as a good practitioner merely on the basis of some positive behavior or some pleasant speech, or because you happen to conform to their expectations. Of the two witnesses, therefore, the principal one is the assurance that you are not faulted by your own mind. So look for spiritual transformation in the way that you relate to other people. We are constantly changing, and others are constantly changing. We'll never completely rid ourselves of our egotistical thoughts, desires, and patterns. It's a matter of improvement, assessing our qualities and seeing if we are making a difference, even a small difference. So to sum this up, are you more open, more tolerant, loving, compassionate towards yourself and others? If you answer this yes, you're showing progress. Now on to slogan 21, always have the support of a joyful mind. When we start out with mind training, we generally are reactive, and our actions are based on emotions and self-centered feelings and so forth, on fear, anxiety, sadness, and loneliness. So the question is, are you more at ease with others and yourself? Is there less influence from your conflicting emotions? Are you happier? So it's important to cultivate happiness and joy. lean into it. Contemplate how you feel when you're having negative emotions, how you feel when you are depressed. Encourage the loving thoughts and emotion. Encourage compassionate thoughts towards yourself and towards others that are suffering. Examine your moods and the thoughts behind your moods. Think about this. Do your conflicting emotions benefit anyone? Do they benefit you? Do they benefit other people? When you're depressed, examine it. How do you feel? Is there any benefit from this depression? Do I get things done when I'm depressed? To really examine this deeply. And other things that you could do is look at a day that you have been relatively happy and examine, how did my day go? Is this better than when I'm unhappy the whole day? There is an experiment that you may be aware of where a social scientist did a study, and he divided his subjects into two groups. Both groups got a happiness test, and then each got $100, and one group was told to go out into the world and spend it on yourself, and the other was spend it on somebody else. Don't spend a penny on yourself, and then come back and we'll give you another happiness test. And of course, the one that came back having given the money to other people were happier than the ones that spent it on themselves. So keep that in mind. He quotes Shantideva here. So come what may, I'll never harm my cheerful happiness of mind. Depression never brings me what I want. My virtue will be warped and marred by it. My own opinion is depression sucks and it's no fun, and I don't recommend it. So we're trying to develop this underlying stable sense of cheerfulness. And we don't have to let obstacles get in the way of that. Seeing what we don't have and not seeing what we do have will certainly get in the way of being cheerful and joyful and happy. So don't focus on seeing what you don't have. It's good to develop some gratitude for what you do have. If you've ever had little children in your house or remember what it was like when you were a child, it's very common for a child to go to a refrigerator that's full of food, and when they don't see what they're looking for, close it and say, "Ma, there's nothing to eat in here." Maybe they were looking for some leftover pizza and there wasn't any. As an adult, we can easily do that too. Be surrounded by things that we can enjoy, but we're not getting exactly what we want, and therefore we're unhappy. There's a new phrase that has come about since social media: fear of missing out. I think that can be put in here too. I don't think this goes back to the great masters of Lojong from the Kadampa tradition, but it's this idea of I'm not happy because I might be missing out on something, and everybody on Facebook is having such a great time. Why aren't I having a great time? So don't think that happiness comes from the material world. The wealthy worry about losing what they have, and ultimately happiness comes from within. He quotes Nagarjuna here, and he wrote this verse roughly 1800 years ago, and this shows you how things haven't changed. Quote, amassing wealth, guarding it, and making it grow will wear you out. Understand that riches bring unending ruin and destruction. That seems very modern. So we want to focus on becoming the kind of person that we want to become. The best way to have this sense of cheerfulness is to set our sights high, but not too high. If we have unrealistic expectations, of course, then we'll fail and we'll become discouraged. So we want to extend ourselves a little bit beyond what you might say is our comfort zone. And having succeeded in that, then push ourselves a little bit more beyond our comfort zone. I one time had a Tibetan tell me that it is the duty of the Lama to push the student further than they would go by themselves. Now here he is saying, push yourselves a little bit further than you would by yourself. There's a Zen saying that came to mind here too, and I believe it is Suzuki Roshi that said this, and it is hasten slowly. It sounds pretty Zen to me. So anyway, some people think it's smart to be negative because there's so much pain in the world. And of course, it's not smart to be negative. It just gets you down and depressed. It's just no fun being negative. There's no joy there. So we can apply compassion and love, and that will bring joy. Now, happiness doesn't mean never feeling sad or depressed or distressed, but it is more having a general optimism towards yourself and towards others and towards the world. He talks about the Dalai Lama and the Karmapa. And I can tell you this, that the Dalai Lama laughs a lot. And people come to him telling him horrible stories of suffering, and yet he still laughs. And Karmapa has a light touch too, that he wants us to be happy. And a number of his talks and his writings, which of course are just talks put into writing, mentions the importance of leaning towards the positive. So keep that in mind. We want to lean towards the positive. We want to have a sense of satisfaction, and this will boost our sense of well-being and so forth. And then he finishes this with a Milarepa song. I'm not going to sing it. I'm just going to read it. Having won the best conditions for Dharma practice, I am happy. Having ceased from evil deeds and left off sinning, I am happy. Treading the path of merit, I am happy. Divorced from hate and injury, I am happy. Having lost all pride and jealousy, I am happy. Understanding the wrongness of the 8 worldly dharmas, I am happy. Using the mind to watch the mind, I am happy. Without hope or fear, I am ever happy. I'm going to finish with 4 lines from a poem by William Blake. Love seeketh not itself to please, but for itself hath any care, but for another gives its ease, and builds a heaven in hell's despair. I thought that kind of fit here too. The last one in this section is 22. You are proficient if you can practice even when distracted. So what this means is that as we become more comfortable, more habituated to practicing Lojong as we go about our daily lives, we aren't even all that much aware of what we're doing. It's become part of us. And this is a result of our negative mental habits being weakened and our positive habits strengthened. And our mental attitudes are more stable and stronger, supported by habit. In this case, this is an important point, that eventually we want to be free of habits, but in the meanwhile, we weaken our negative habits and strengthen our positive habits. It's good to have positive habitual patterns. So as a result of this, you might say, internalizing mind training, we can spontaneously apply the remedies to various difficult situations that we come across, and our mind becomes much more stable. So even when we're distracted, we don't lose it. You might say, maintain our balance. There's a quote here by John Guncantrell. A skilled horseman does not fall off his horse even when he is distracted. In the same way, if you are able to take adverse conditions that suddenly develop as aids to mind training, even without expressly directing your attention to do so, then you are proficient in mind training. The two bodhicittas are clearly and effortlessly along with everything that appears: enemies, friends, troublemakers, happiness or suffering. So I thought maybe it'd be good to go into a little bit here about riding a horse, since maybe some of you haven't. And when you become an expert at riding a horse, you don't have to hang on so tightly. You are balanced, and even if the horse suddenly moves to one side or the other or does something unpredictable, you maintain your balance. You might have to grab a hold a little bit harder, but you maintain your balance. Think about it. The Native Americans were excellent horsemen. They did not have saddles and stirrups to hold on to. They maintained their balance just bareback on a horse. It's very difficult to do, but this is what is being discussed here. As you practice mind training, it becomes second nature. It becomes part of you. And even though you are not consciously trying to practice it, you do it naturally. You don't get caught off balance or off guard or blindsided. So this is the way I would explain that analogy with horsemanship. And the two bodhicittas, of course, are compassion. An absolute bodhicitta is appearance emptiness. Meditation is important, essential, in fact, to develop this natural inclination to maintain your balance when you are practicing and something suddenly arises. So as we train, our mind starts reacting spontaneously. Even when adversities suddenly arise, we are able to work with them in a very skillful way. And this is a very good sign that your mind training practice is working. Tralek Rinpoche talks about this. He has the analogy of enduring a chronic, dull pain in order to avoid an acute, sharp pain. And he uses this to describe the samsaric situation that us human beings are in, that we would rather endure very unpleasant situations because we're comfortable with it, it's familiar, and trying something different is really scary and it might be painful. So we just keep on doing the same old, and being dissatisfied, unhappy, suffering, and so forth. The point is, with mind training, we can develop the motivation to escape from these very painful, difficult, samsaric situations that we feel trapped in. I think a modern word would be burnout in terms of employment, where you've been working at a certain job for years and years and years, and you can't wait to retire, but you would not dare quit and try something else because that's too frightening. So we can empathize with the pain and suffering of others, and we can in doing so, progress on the path, increase our compassion, increase our understanding for other people. With the mind training, if we apply it throughout our lives in all situations, adverse situations become aids to us, and they will propel us along the path. He says that we should be satisfied with mind training to the extent that we are moving forward, that there is some progress, and take pleasure in living, applying mindfulness and awareness, and again, have some joy when you are going through your daily life. In terms of small actions, that there's nothing insignificant, that even little actions can accumulate and produce significant results. We have to be careful of small negative actions, and on the other hand, small beneficial actions can be very important. And do not discount small positive actions. Don't become complacent. I think that's a good word for it. So, to sum all this up, generate mindfulness and awareness, take pleasure in living and having the right view. If we can respond to others with less jealousy, egotism, and so forth, if we can demonstrate more kindness, we are making progress in mind training. He has a conclusion here, and I'm going to sum up his conclusion. The purpose of these 4 slogans is to gauge our progress. It's good to recall them from time to time, but we don't have to obsess about them. Slogans will help us see what we need to do to correct our practice and how to direct our practice. We should have confidence that everything we do leaves an impression on us. And of course, we want to leave a positive mental impression. And finally, that all Buddhist practice is to transcend our egotistical obsession and to dispel ignorance.